In this unit, we're talking about the pioneering of Arkansas in the Southwest and manifest destiny as it relates to that. So in order to talk about pioneering, let's create a definition for pioneer. We're going to refer to a pioneer as one of the first people to do something. So I would pose this question to you. Were Americans truly pioneers of the West? Do we fit this definition? In class, we have this discussion, and generally someone pops in and says, no, not really, because there were already people there. So for sure, I mean, there were already Native Americans in the West. There were people from other countries who had already settled in the West among the Native Americans. So from land grants that they had from either Spain or France from time to time. So there were already other people in the West. But for the sake of the idea of pioneering, then we are going to consider that Americans were pioneers of the West, although we do know that there were already people there. So these Americans were people who were the first among their country to go into the West. So for that reason, they were pioneers. Just to backtrack a little bit, a reminder that the Louisiana Purchase is what added so much territory to the United States, and that Louisiana Purchase territory was acquired in 1803 from France. And we had two main expeditions that explored the area. Lewis and Clark made the biggest exploration with their expedition from May 1804 to October 1805. They explored the Missouri River, and they were hoping to find a passage to the Pacific. So they were hoping it was much closer than the Pacific actually was. So they explored the Missouri River, and if you think back to the video that we watched, remember they went all the way over these mountains only to find when they got across to the other side that there had been a shortcut all along. Now they took it when they went back, so yay for Lewis and Clark, but you know, how horrible would it be to make that treacherous route and then find out there had been a much easier way all along. Anyway, so Lewis and Clark did that. Hunter and Dunbar explored our area, the area along the Washita River. And they did that also from 1804 to 1805, but a much shorter span of time, from October 1804 to January 1805. Now, both expeditions were important because they gathered information about the climate, the animals, the plants, the natural resources, and you know, another important fact of their exploration was who were the people who were already there. So the government very definitely understood that there were people already in this Louisiana Purchase territory. Also important to know about the animals and plants because they were a food source. So very important information that both expeditions gained through their touring and exploration of the Louisiana Purchase. So how do you get people to populate an area? One of the ways that Arkansas benefited was from, I struggle to call it PR because as far as public relations go, it wasn't necessarily a predetermined intent to get people to come to this area. However, it kind of happened to work out that way. The way that this PR was done was actually through book publication. There were two main ones. One of those is Henry Schoolcraft's Journal of a Tour into the Interior of Missouri and Arkansas. And notice the spelling of Arkansas here. That was how it was spelled in his book. At the time, you might see Arkansas spelled with a W at the end. Sometimes it was spelled with just an A at the end, and even other times it was maybe an S or maybe a U even. So you never really knew how you were going to see it spelled. But so these books were written in a way that encouraged people to go. Now, it's not an advertisement like you might think of or a commercial, you know, something like that. But just from the descriptions, people wanted to go. Now, I thought it was kind of interesting that this one in particular kind of tells the not so great side of things as well. So They're not trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes in this particular writing by Schoolcraft. So this is actually a journal entry. So he is exploring the territory and visiting, and he's writing about his travels. He mentions stopping at a Mr. Williams' home to prepare breakfast, and that was really common. People would get to know other people in their exploration, and they would make those connections, create a network, and that might be a place where you would stop to prepare lunch outdoors or to join a family even for lunch if they invited you to do so. And we see that there were some hunters gathering to hear a preacher. There were preachers on this course. We'll look at those in a few minutes. Then we see some excitement prevails among the people occupying the right bank of the White River on account of the recent treaty concluded with the Cherokee Indians. By it, those Indians relinquish certain tracts of land in the state of Tennessee, but are to receive in exchange the lands lying between the north bank of the Arkansas, as in the Arkansas River, and the south bank of the White River. Those people, therefore, who have located themselves upon the right bank of the river and have improved farms are now necessitated to relinquish them, which is considered a piece of injustice. So we have this, we talked about this, I believe, in the last unit, where the Osage were moved out so the Cherokee could be moved in to a portion of northwest Arkansas. And in doing that, the federal government was able to take their land in other places and to continue pushing them westward. And this is what they're talking about here. So there were squatters, basically, who had moved into the territory, who had improved the land, and who had started agriculture, growing things, probably as subsistence farmers, and built homes, and now had to give them up because the federal government was reclaiming that territory land as their own, and they were putting Native Americans on it. So they're not pulling the wool over anyone's eyes here, but because they are talking about this negative aspect as far as the pioneers would have gone. But it also very much sets the idea of community, right? We have met a Mr. Williams. We're going to stop there for breakfast. There's a preacher in the area, so there is religion in this territory. Maybe it's not such a lawless place after all. Maybe it's a decent place. So all of these things create an image of Arkansas that might have been attractive to people who were interested in pioneering. One of the other books written during this time period was by Thomas Nuttall, and he wrote A Journey on the Travels into the Arkansas Territory, and we see Arkansas spelled the way we spell it today. So you can see, spelling was at the will of whomever was writing. His article, or his writing in his book, says, at about 12 o'clock, the thermometer was again at 67 degrees. In the course of the forenoon, I took a solitary ramble down the bank of the river and found along its shelving border, where the sun obtained free access, abundance of the mimosa, and I'm going to stop there because all of these scientific names are very foreign to me. So anyway, what I want to point out here is just how nice that sounds. The temperature is mild at 67 degrees. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, and oh my goodness, the sun. The sun has, where is it? The sun obtained free access. That means it is wherever it wants to be, and it is large. It is filling the sky here in Arkansas. And this ramble down the bank of the river sounds like a float trip around a lazy river or something. So very much sets a picture of kind of a paradise, and people who were interested in pioneering would have been drawn to that. Now, one of the things that's really unique about what Nuttall does with his journal is that he is recording all of the trees and the shrubs and the plants and the the flowers of the area. He's recording all of that in terms of scientific terms because he was a scientist, and that was his purpose. He wanted to record those things to let people know what they could expect to find here. It's important to know you can find pecan trees because pecans are nuts that provide, a food source. There are different trees and plants that you can eat that grew wild. And so it was very important for someone who knew those things to record those things. And that's what Nuttall did. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times that these would have encouraged people who were pioneers to, come check out the area. I say that because pioneering wasn't for everyone. It definitely wasn't for the weak. I don't like to camp, to be honest with you. I don't see me as a pioneer for sure. There's a lot of roughing it that goes with pioneering and starting from scratch, making a place for yourself. The kind of people that this appealed to are people who have no roots anywhere else. Maybe they didn't have family or friends that were tying them to a particular community. Maybe they were people who really had nothing to lose. Maybe they literally had no property, and this was their one chance to actually earn property. So those are the kinds of people who were coming to the area. So in addition to those people who wanted to come to the area, there were people who enjoyed a challenge. They were entrepreneurs, and many entrepreneurs took up the government on offers of land grants. Now, some people didn't, but there were a number of land grants that were devised to help increase population in the Arkansas Territory. So we've already talked about in a previous unit about the land grants that were given to veterans of the War of 1812. Most of this was swampland in Arkansas, but it was land. And the primary idea here is that it's important to own land, and very important at the time that if you wanted to accumulate any kind of wealth at all, you needed to own land. At least land for your own home, but the more land you had, the more money that you had or had access to, because you could always sell land if you needed money. You could always use that land to produce agriculturally too, so that land was important for that way as well. But these land grants to the veterans, not many veterans moved to Arkansas. So over time, Congress says, you know what, the veterans are not moving to this area, so we can let their heirs do that if they want. So they could actually pass down these land grants to heirs, to younger people in the family who might actually want this pioneering chance. Even then, they did not include or did not increase population greatly in the state. So in 1852, Congress began allowing the veterans to sell these, and that's when a lot of veterans started turning loose of their Arkansas land grants to swampland. Those were sold to speculators, as we previously mentioned, and they were people who were willing to buy land if it was cheap enough just to see what might be made of it. In 1815, land grants for the New Madrid claims arose because there were earthquakes along the New Madrid fault line in northeastern Arkansas. And those earthquakes caused a great deal of damage. We looked it up earlier in class today and saw that the 1811 earthquake at the area where we now know as Blytheville had an 8.6 on the Richter scale earthquake. So huge earthquake that really damaged everything there. So for people who had damage to property, they were given these land grants as a chance to relocate to unclaimed public land throughout the territory for free. And a lot of that land was in the Arkansas River Valley, so many people moved there and actually did very well. In 1827, seminary land grants are established to provide university learning. The idea behind that is that it's important to offer higher education to create the appearance of a civilized society. One of the things that Arkansas has going against it is all of this dueling that we've been talking about, and also the lawlessness that has accompanied the early settlement of the territory. So, if you can have university learning, then you can have an educated group of people who maybe act a little more civilized. So that's why the university land grants were important. Now, these colleges were not built right away, but they are there for establishing a state university. In 1829, 16th section lands are provided for public schools. That's federally. So in 1843, Congress decided to allow the Arkansas legislature to sell those lands as they needed or as they saw fit instead, because there were not a lot of public schools at this particular point, because there were many times when all hands had to be working. So public school was not yet required, it was optional, and it was largely for people who could afford for their kids to not be at home working, which was very slim in terms of our population. The people who could afford private school did that. So no harm, no foul in that regard at that particular time. In 1832, saline lands were maintained for federal ownership. The U.S. tried to preserve or reserve all of these lands from private ownership after the Louisiana Purchase had been made. So we're talking about salt possession. So the U.S. federal government wanted to own all the lands with access to saline pits or saline mines, if you will, along the rivers that were in part of the Louisiana Purchase. But a few years later, in the 1840s, when salt was cheaper, the federal regulation on those land grants ended, and the state could then sell those lands as they saw fit. And then in 1836, when Arkansas becomes a state bank is created to not issue grants necessarily, but to issue land loans to people who wanted to pioneer and move into the area. The problem was they issued land loans to the leading citizens of the communities, largely the politically strong people like the family that we talked about so much this semester. They were strong in politics, economy, and in society. So most of the land loans went to people who already had money. It didn't act like it was established to do. And in 1837, Joseph Anthony, at a meeting of the state legislature, points this out. He says that there is a big problem with the state bank. He refers to it as the spoils problem, referring to the spoils system where people who get elected to positions give favors to those who got them there. And so he's saying that this family, this political dynasty, is not working as it should because it's creating this holdup in the bank, and it's saving all of the bank money for its favorite people. As luck would have it, the Speaker of the House, John Wilson, was also the bank president, and he was not very happy that Anthony had made these claims. And throughout this legislative session, Anthony made several of these claims, and then the last one he made was really basically a snide, sarcastic remark that was, it's too bad we don't have a bank that operates fairly that could get people into this community or into this state. And that's the last remark it took. And, John Wilson takes out his Bowie knife and kills Anthony right there on the legislative floor. So a Bowie knife, what is a Bowie knife? Well, basically it's a hunting knife, or if you've lived in Arkansas for very long, you might call it a hunting knife, because that's how we say things around here. So anyway, this Bowie knife became popular in the 1830s after Jim Bowie killed a man in a duel, because dueling was a thing, and he killed a man in a duel with a big knife, and it was a big knife that looked like this one on your screen. Now, Jim Bowie later died at the Alamo, but it was this knife that gained him so much attention, basically because his brother promoted it as the Bowie knife. He really wanted their family name to stick to this knife. It turns out that James Black of Old Washington is credited for making this knife for Jim Bowie, and that's what a Bowie knife looks like. So as we begin talking about when Arkansas becomes a state, I want to backtrack a little bit to talk about the Missouri Compromise. slavery was already an issue in the country. As early as the late 1700s, we had people petitioning Congress to ask for an end to slavery. It was not a popular request and it did not happen, but Quakers were actually on the forefront of this abolitionist movement. So slavery had been in question for a long time, even by 1820 when the Missouri Compromise came along. So the Missouri Compromise was basically created to establish some rules about admission of states into the Union from the Louisiana Purchase territory. So we're not talking about lands everywhere, just about the Louisiana Purchase lands. So Missouri wanted to be admitted as a slave state. And you can see on this map that Missouri is above this red line that separates the Arkansas Territory in Missouri and the rest of the unorganized Louisiana Purchase territory there in orange. So if Missouri entered as a slave state, it would have thrown the balance off kilter in the Senate. So a compromise was created to allow Maine to enter the Union as a free state, with Missouri to enter as a slave state. So at that point, the balance is still the same. Then a rule was made that only the areas below this red line border, which is the southern border of Missouri, would be allowed to enter the Union as a slave state. So basically, we are talking there. Now, Louisiana has already been admitted at this particular point. So really the only place that this impacts is the area that we now know as Arkansas and a big chunk of Oklahoma that could be entered as a slave state. So that would not have thrown off the balance in the Senate. We're not talking about this area that is owned by Mexico, that's part of Spain, that would now include, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, those areas. I mean, those aren't included because they were not part of the Louisiana Purchase. And that's why when Florida is admitted to the Union, it is allowed to be admitted as a slave state because it was not part of the Louisiana Purchase. So still, even with the addition of Florida, Florida was not a huge upset in terms of balance in the Senate, even though it enters with another slave state. And we can look at that next. Okay, here's the chart I wanted to show you. So the Missouri Compromise has Maine and Missouri enter together as a free state and a slave state. So when Arkansas enters the Union, it's based on this idea, this precedent that, hey, look, the last two entered as slave and free, and we've heard that someone else is entering as free. We need to jump at the opportunity now to enter as slave. And that's what Arkansas did. You can see there Arkansas was the slave state admitted with Michigan as a free state. But then we have Florida and Texas. As I mentioned before, Florida was not part of the Louisiana Purchase, so it was not part of the Missouri Compromise law. So Florida could enter as a slave state, and it did. The thing about Florida is that, yes, Florida had slavery and had slavery during colonial times, but not all of the African Americans in Florida were slaves. Some were free. Some had bought their freedom. Some were there because they were freed through the process of manumission. There were other slaves there too. There were some Creole slaves who were in the area. And anyway, so Florida had a history of slavery. It was an odd history of slavery based on the terms that, it wasn't an end-all, beat-all kind of full-force slavery that we think of when we think of the Confederate States. So, but it was a slave state. And because it was not part of because it was not part of the Louisiana Purchase, I did not highlight it in yellow here. So that's why it's in blue. So when it came down to considering the state process, becoming a state, Arkansas's territory legislature didn't feel like Arkansas, the territory, was ready to become Arkansas, the state. Yes, maybe more people would come if it became a state, and if it entered as a state at the right time, it could enter as a slave state, and it was part of the southern part of the border for the Missouri Compromise, so it had that going for it if it wanted to maintain slavery. So basically it could maintain slavery and maybe more people would come. There were more cons though than there were pros. And I say that if you're looking at the slides, you can see that there are 2 pros and 2 cons listed. So in that way they'd be, equal. However, the cons greatly outweighed the pros in that the territory funding would end. As Arkansas Territory, the federal government funded the territory. When Arkansas would become a state, that federal territory funding would stop, and Arkansas would be expected to pay its own way as a state, and you do that through tax revenue. There were not enough tax resources in the state. That's largely the fault of the family. Again, we're talking about that political dynasty that has pretty much built Arkansas to serve them. So the reason is that they were the people who had most of the land, and they also had most of the political power. So they established a political setup in which they didn't have to pay very much in taxes. So this territory was not making any money in taxes, not enough to sustain itself as a state for sure. And this was something that William Fulton, who was the territory's junior senator, really focused on when this whole discussion about becoming a state started taking place. And generally, everyone in the territory's legislature agreed with that. So there was a general consensus from the state legislature and the people representing the territory at the Senate level that Arkansas was not ready to become a state. However, Ambrose Sevier found out that Michigan was thinking of becoming a state, and it was going to enter the Union as a free state. Now, the idea that that would tip the balance of the Senate in favor of abolitionists or free states, Sevier decided that it was time for Arkansas to jump and to enter as a slave state. So they maintained that balance of power in Washington, D.C. Again, this is not something that the state has approved, but Sevier, who is from the family, decides he's going to make an executive decision, and he's going to proceed with statehood for Arkansas Territory. And he does that. Now, when he comes back and explains, hey, look, this is what was about to happen. I kind of saved us from being off balance in D.C., then the family supported him, and as long as they supported him, everyone else in politics in this now state of Arkansas also supported that decision, despite the financial hardship that it created. Some people have pondered, how would things in Arkansas have been different if the territory had waited until it was better prepared for statehood. But that's just one of those, what if things that we would have to consider. So in terms of Ambrose Sevier, he aligned himself when he got elected officially to the Senate with Andrew Jackson, and he became very popular in the area, very important in terms of chairing other committees like the Indian Affairs Committee and the Foreign Relations Committees. He ended up serving in the Senate for a period of 12 years and grew very close with President Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party became the state's Democratic Party at that point because Sevier was tied so closely to the president. He supported Manifest Destiny, the idea that Americans should go west because They should take what's rightfully theirs, what's been given to them by God to take, and to spread their democracy, their Christianity, and their capitalism. So he supported all of that. His career had kind of a blah ending. He ended up in financial scandal over some fraudulent dealings with the Arkansas Real Estate Bank. His wife died after a long terminal illness. He himself became sick while he was working on a treaty in Mexico as Foreign Relations Committee representative, or chairman, I should say. He got sick and he could not work anymore as a senator. So Borland, who was one of the two newspaper guys that fought each other in a duel and then later became best friends, if you guys remember it from the previous unit. Anyway, Borland was appointed to replace Sevier in the Senate until he could retake office. But Borland kind of double crosses him and won't leave. So he asked for a vote, and Borland actually wins the election by 4 votes, which is the end of Sevier's political career. So what's happening with the Native Americans as the territory shifts from Arkansas Territory to statehood? Well, there weren't a lot of Quapaw in the territory left to worry about. There were 700 at the time Arkansas entered statehood. The Caddo had already moved into Louisiana, and there were a few Osage left in Arkansas Territory, but the bulk of the Osage actually lived in Missouri and crossed into this territory to hunt. So not a lot of Native Americans to be concerned with in terms of territory entering statehood. So if you remember, our first geography lesson for this course didn't show Cherokee as one of the main tribes in the state, and that was true. At the time of the Louisiana Purchase, there were about 500 Cherokee in the state, largely because of shifting population and Americans pushing the Native Americans westward. Some Cherokee ended up in this territory. The population, however, grows to about 5,000 by 1819 because Jefferson provides lands in the Louisiana Purchase area, including Arkansas, in exchange for having the Cherokee move from their lands in Alabama and Georgia. Now, from Alabama and Georgia, they're pushed to Tennessee, and from Tennessee into Arkansas, so it kind of happens in a large push. So we have Cherokee trickling in for a good time period here. But some of the Cherokee were living in the Blytheville area during those earthquakes, so they were able to take advantage of those land grants. And they actually flourished in the Arkansas River Valley after those 1811 and 1812 earthquakes. So they were very happy with the River Valley land. It was very fertile and provided transportation for trade and all of that stuff. So the Cherokee thrived there, and that's when their population actually grew to about 5,000. In 1824, though, the East and West, the Cherokee Nation splits into the East and West. So 2 different sections. And despite getting some land in Arkansas, the 1828 treaty plus territory pressures keep pushing the Cherokee, along with other Native American tribes, into Indian territory in Oklahoma. I want to point out that OK stands for Oklahoma. It's not okay that this happened. It's just O and K are the abbreviation for Oklahoma. The Quapaw were one of those main tribes in the state of Arkansas when we had the early explorers even here, the earliest of the explorers through the area. So in 1818, the Quapaw signed a treaty to give up their land between the Arkansas and Red Rivers in exchange for land between the Arkansas, Washita, and Saline Rivers. So at this point, we're kind of talking about an area that would include the areas that we're in, between the Washita and the Saline Rivers. So between, Arkadelphia, Malvern, Benton, and then up closer to the Red River. So, that's a nice piece of land. It's fertile in the area. But so they signed the treaty, But then white settlers decide that it would be great for growing cotton, so another treaty in 1825 pushes the Quapaw into Louisiana and out of this sweet area that they had been given in 1818. So now they're pushed into Louisiana with the Caddo. Now, I want to take a minute to point out here that it seems like at this point that the federal government has assigned Native Americans, or Indians as the term was of the day, are all the same, and it's hard to fathom that today, the idea that all Native Americans are the same. Nothing was further from the truth, because different tribes had different beliefs and different cultures, different social hierarchies. There were so many things about each Native American tribe that made it unique. So to push the Quapaw into territory that the Caddo had already been pushed into, it didn't always, and I'm not saying there was a lot of fighting or anything, but culturally there was no good reason to do that. Some Quapaw, though, because the area that they went to was pretty much northern Louisiana. They didn't go very deep into the state of Louisiana, so they were hovering right around the border. Some of the Quapaw actually came back to Arkansas until they were officially removed again by the treaty in 1833 to Indian Territory, also in Oklahoma. One of the first trails that encouraged significant settlement in Arkansas was the Southwest Trail. And the first significant settlement began around 1810 in the area that we now know as Batesville. So that area grew up. The population began to focus there instead of from Arkansas Post. Arkansas Post would have been down, if you're looking at the map, in the kind of west central part, I'd say between Scott and Pine Bluff, kind of in that area. So it moves the population's focus from there up to northeast Arkansas. And the French influence from Arkansas Post starts to decline. So we see a shift in population and a shift in culture. This road was often referred to as Military Road by many of the surveyors who came through to survey land for the state and through the territory. So the Southwest Trail was very important. You can see if we start at Texarkana, it's pretty much I-30, if you look at it that way. And you can see how it deviates a little bit, but it kind of follows that east to west from Texarkana to Little Rock anyway. Along I-30. One of the early settlers along the Southwest Trail was Jacob Barkman, who lived in Arkadelphia. Now, if you were traveling the Southwest Trail, you would probably stay at someone's house who lived along the trail. Whether you stayed in their home or you stayed on their property, maybe you stopped there to have a meal, or just to relax for a while, because there weren't rest stops or restaurants or heaven forbid a hotel, right? As a matter of fact, residents often offered a room. If they had an extra room, they'd rent that out to travelers for somewhere between 75 cents to $1.25 a night. But Jacob Barkman was one of these early settlers along the Southwest Trail. He and his wife met up with his brother and sister-in-law and their slaves, and they joined a group that was organized by John Hemphill to travel together, and they set out from Louisiana to head up to this area, the Arkansas Territory, in 1811, and they settled in a little town called Blakelytown, which is now Arkadelphia. But he built a brick house near the Caddo River, and there were Indian mounds there. So you can still see one of the mounds today. There were two originally, and there was a brick house there. The brick house has since been gone as well. It burned later on, but so this these Indian mounds were important. If you're in Arkadelphia, or let's see, if you're leaving Caddo Valley and heading toward Henderson on the highway, and right after you pass Taco Bell and after you pass the little bridge over the Caddo River, if you look to your right, the first road to your right is called Military Road, which is basically the Southwest Trail, right? So there's a marker there that says Barkman's house had been there at one time. Again, you can't see the house. You can still see one of the Indian mounds there. The second one was excavated for archival purposes and for archaeology purposes, so it's not there. But don't go there. Don't go there and prowl around because it's private property, and you go to jail for that. So don't do that. Anyway, but that's where the house was, and he would use those Indian mounds to stand on top of to watch horse races to see who would win, because Barkman was from Kentucky, and he was, into horse racing. That was a thing in Kentucky, and so he brought horse racing to Clark County, Arkansas as well. They'd have these horse races there. Eventually, it became a stop for stagecoaches. It was the county's first courthouse. I mean, yes, his house was the county's first courthouse, and sometimes it was even used as a jail. It became a post office later on, and he was postmaster. So there were many perks to having a brick house on the Caddo River, especially part of the Southwest Trail. Jacob Barkman also built the first textile mill in Arkansas. Now, it burned early on in a fire and he didn't rebuild it, but he did build the first one here in the state. He also operated several salt works along the Washita River. This man accumulated 22,000 acres of land, largely in that county, by the time he died. Now, at the time, Clark County, and it's been a while since we've looked at that map, but it would have included a larger section, so that land was spread out quite a bit. When he died, some of his land was sold to Arkadelphia Methodist College to build a university, which is now Henderson State University. The campus at HSU is actually built on a former cotton field owned by Barkman. Remember, part of Manifest Destiny is the spreading of religion too. So trail preachers were important to the development of the state. Henry's Chapel was the first Methodist church built in Arkansas. It was built in 1817 near the town of Old Washington in Hempstead County. 30 families moved there to start the church, led by preacher Reverend John Henry, and for that reason it was called Henry's Chapel. By 1820, this area was the most densely populated in the territory with 2,000 people. And then the next church to be built was Salem Church. It was the first Baptist church in Arkansas, built in 1818 near Columbia. So just wanted to show you this map again as we start talking exactly about westward expansion and the idea of manifest destiny. So the Louisiana Purchase, if you'll recall, was this large area here, U.S. territory, the orange area. Now, initially, it included most of Louisiana, because remember, the whole reason we bought it was because we wanted New Orleans so much. And that's why Louisiana was pulled as the first state out of the purchase to be admitted to the Union. So the United States could always secure that New Orleans port. It was that important for trade for the United States. And from the map from the previous page, the area that we now know as Texas was still part of control of Spain through Mexico. So Mexico is doing something to build territory as well. They are offering land grants too. This 1833 map shows grants from Mexico that were given to American settlers in the area that we now know as Texas. So all of these little different colors here, the blue, the green, the yellow, the red, Those are all different sections of land that were granted to impresarios who were these Americans who took a land grant in exchange for settling that land. They had to bring people with them to settle the territory. It wasn't enough to just go there and build a fence, or go there and build a house, or go there and plant a garden. They had to actually bring settlers with them. So that's what the impresarios did. Now, the other people in the region were the Tejanos, the Mexican residents of the region. So we have residents from Mexico living in Texas, and then we have these impresarios who are bringing in people in exchange for a land grant. But there are some problems with these land grants and the American citizens who are going into this territory owned by Mexico to create, to settle the area that we now know as Texas. One of the problems was that American immigrants quickly began to outnumber the Tejanos, the Mexican residents of the territory. The Americans didn't feel like they had a representation in the Texas-Mexico legal system. They didn't like that at all. They were especially angry when Mexico ended slavery in 1829. So these are people who were largely coming from the South into Texas, and they wanted to bring their slaves with them. So in 1830, it's like Mexico had this revelation, was like, let's just stop U.S. immigration into Mexico. Let's just stop it altogether. And then they increased their military presence through that area that we showed on the last slide, where all of the land grants were. Even despite that, even with the increased military presence and the fact that U.S. immigration was illegal, American settlers still continued to illegally cross that border to claim lands in Texas, Mexico. So in 1833, a group of American settlers were fed up, and they met to write a constitution for an independent Texas. They wanted to suspend all taxes. They wanted to return immigration as a possibility to bring in more U.S. citizens into the territory. And they wanted better protection from Native American tribes. They also wanted more land grants. So this is an image of Mexico's president, Santa Anna, who agrees to everything except granting this area an independent Texas status. So he did approve suspension of taxes and did start immigration again, although he canceled it later. He also started providing better protection from Native American tribes and more land grants for these people. Again, he reverses course on these decisions later, but it's enough to give these American settlers what they want, mostly what they want initially. So when Santa Anna recalls the promises that he made to these Americans in Texas, they decide to form their own Lone Star Republic. The American Texans meet in March 1836 and declare their independence from Mexico. And they have the full support of the Tejanos, the Mexican residents living in the area, because they've heard all of the things, all of the government reform that declaring independence could bring if they joined the United States, which is the main goal at this point of this Texas Lone Star Republic. They want to leave Mexico and become part of the United States. And the Tejanos are all for it, as long as it brings the government reforms and all the benefits of being an American citizen with it. They established that slavery would be permitted in Texas. So Texas, now independent, wants to become part of the United States. In order to do that, they have to operate and kind of group and organize as a republic first. They elect Sam Houston as president of Texas in September 1836. And very quickly, Texas votes to annex with the United States. But the U.S. is not so quick to jump at this opportunity. There are few concerns. First of all, it would be part of the Missouri Compromise, as far as it would have to enter as a southern state, which would make it a slave state, which is okay with the people of Texas. That's what they wanted. But how would that impact the balance in Washington, D.C. in terms of Congress? So that was a concern. It would also really greatly upset U.S. and Mexico relations for sure. So Texas has to become the Lone Star Republic for a while. It gets recognition from France and Great Britain, Belgium, and the Netherlands as its own country, which is important for protection against Mexico, and it's also important for the United States that Mexico sees that these other nations have recognized Texas as its own country, not part of the United States. It's not until 1837 that the United States recognizes Texas as its own country. So, it takes a little time, and that shows Mexico that the United States is not in a hurry to push for some sort of annex, because the main focus here was keeping good relations between the United States and Mexico. And then, in the end, Texas pushes out the Native Americans and the Tejanos, who helped them earn their independence and who supported the independent nation that would become Texas. So Texas does not join the United States as a state until 1845. There are some disputes about the border, the southernmost border of Texas. So Mexico says that the southernmost border is the Nueces River, which is the short river here, and the United States says no, it's the Rio Grande. So there's a big difference there in terms of where the border is. So it's the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that actually sets the Rio Grande as the border, which ends up giving the United States an additional 525,000 square miles of territory. It's almost as big as the 827 that the Louisiana Purchase gave to the United States. So I mentioned this several times already, but I wanted to include it here for you as a reminder of the definition of manifest destiny. This was not a term that was always around. It was actually a term coined in 1845. Manifest destiny is the idea that the United States is destined by God to expand its domain, that it's expected to expand its capitalism, democracy, and Christianity. And in terms of manifest destiny, we generally associate that with westward expansion, which is what we're talking about in this unit. And I want to finish this unit by taking a look at this painting, which is by John Gast, called American Progress, and it's from 1872. If you do a search for manifest destiny art, this usually comes up. And I'll tell you in a minute why I was doing that search myself a couple of years ago. But this art is really interesting because if you blow it up, it's almost like a history of transportation all in one painting. We have people on foot, we have people on horseback, we have horse-drawn carriages, we have a stagecoach, we have a train, we have ships in the harbor, and there's a bridge there. So we have lots of transportation represented here. You'll notice too, let's take a look at, let's look at the animals here. We have buffalo, lots of buffalo off in the distance, so there's plenty of food to eat there. And then we have these men in the forefront at the right corner who are using ox to plow. So, they have modern conveniences like this. You can domesticate the animals there. You can plow a garden, which implies that you can grow food there. Also, if you look in the left corner at the bottom, you see this bear. And this bear is looking back and growling, but these pioneers are not afraid of that bear. So that says a lot. They are strong enough not to even be bothered by this bear. they are actually pushing the bear away by, walking toward him. So they are doing with the animals what they need to in order to get where they want to go. If you look very close too, on the other side of the river, across from or behind the bear, you have Native Americans who are depicted here as they're unclothed, or these women are largely unclothed, and the men are in their headdresses and depicted as savages. Now they're very scared of this image that they're seeing in the sky, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but you see that these Native Americans are pushed into darkness, and this light is about to shine upon them as soon as this creature flies overhead. So this is literally a depiction of Americans bringing light into the West. If you think about light, it takes people out of darkness, right? And light also brings, if you have an idea, one of the iconic representations of that is a light bulb over your head. So light brings enlightenment, it brings thought, it brings civilization. And so this woman, this being that is flying or floating toward the west, is Columbia. She is the female figure of America, and she is leading and guiding Americans into the West by carrying these values, these American values, with her. Now, part of that is depicted through her Roman garb. So she's wearing kind of this Roman tunic that would very much symbolize the ideas of democracy and the ideas of civilized communication, civilized community. And speaking of communication, she also has a telegraph wire with her. It's wrapped up around the elbow of one arm, and then she's stringing it with her free arm. So she's actually stringing telegraph wire to improve communications through the West. So this is the idea that Americans are going to tame this savage West. And she's also bringing a book, which implies that she's bringing with her knowledge. So we have in this painting represented the ideas that Americans pushing to the West will bring with them knowledge, enlightenment, communication, and all things civilized. Also, there's one more thing. I wish I could zoom in closer for you, but if you can't see it, you'll have to trust me. There is a star in her hair at the top of her forehead, and this is known as the Star of Empire. And that was a phrase that was used a lot along the lines of Manifest Destiny, the Star of Empire. And that's basically another way to say Manifest Destiny, that the Star of Empire will bring all of these things, will bring goodness and purity, which is also associated with the color white, and her skin is very white, so as is her robe, obviously. But so we have then this idea that Manifest Destiny is going to fix the West, and it's the God-given right of all of these Americans to have that opportunity to do so, because one of the ways that was justified was that it would bring enlightenment to these savages, to the savages who were already there. The story I wanted to share with you about the Star of the Empire is that I had a friend who was doing some genealogy research, and she found an old obituary for one of her ancestors that had been printed in an early newspaper, and it said that he came to Arkansas on the Star of Empire. And I thought, what is that, a train? So we start digging, and every time we search Star of Empire, this image came up. And so we got out some books and started looking, and Star of Empire and Manifest Destiny were pretty much used interchangeably. So his obituary was saying that he came to Arkansas as part of Manifest Destiny, that he was an early settler who came here for opportunity. He actually had a land grant, and he came here to settle and build a home in an area where he had a chance to make something of nothing. So anyway, I wanted to share that story with you along with this image, because this really sums up how Americans approached the idea of manifest destiny.